Hello, welcome to a series of online conversations with practitioners in the visual arts. Is broadcast by New Local Space, a contemporary art initiative in Kingston, Jamaica, and a subsidiary of audio production house Creative Sounds. This evening, I'm chatting with artist Phillip Thomas. Phillip Thomas is a Kingston-based artist. His work asks questions about social identity that challenge many traditions about this very subject in Jamaica, critiquing Jamaican culture, including what he refers to as the willfully invisible middle class and their relationship to the wider populace. Thomas's work has been included in numerous exhibitions, including contemporary Jamaican artists at the Art Gallery of Mississauga, Canada, and multiple Jamaica biennials at the National Gallery of Jamaica. He is a graduate of the Edna Manley College of the Visual and Performing Arts in Kingston and received his MFA from the New York Academy of Art. Thomas has been the recipient of numerous awards, fellowships, and grants, including the Bronze Musgrave Medal for Excellence in Art, the Aaron Matalon Award, the Albert Huey Prize, the Cobb Family Foundation grant, and a scholarship from the Chase Fund. Phillip, thanks for being here on We've wanted to have you on the program for some time now.
Thanks for the invite. Your listeners may not know this, but actually we've been talking about having this conversation for a long time now.
Mm-hmm.
And finally it's come to a head where we can talk about the politics more so than just art in our country.
Yes. So let's jump right into it. I have so many questions for you. So you deal with portraiture. So obviously I'm going to start the conversation off speaking about portraiture. There are portraits, paintings that you've made that where I can clearly tell they're paintings of you, even though you're absent. Your figure is actually absent. Self-portraiture almost through self-erasure. How does portraiture function as a conceptual framework for you generally, and in these particular self-portraits of absence?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily use the term erasure because not that it's necessarily incorrect, but I'd like to give the listener an opportunity to understand what the term might mean in how you're using it. Now, if you look at how black paint is used in relation to people like Kerry James Marshall or a whole wide range of artists, there's a difference between what we call silhouette versus a figure painted in like very, very dark paint, right? And so within that line, you sort of traverse varying degrees of visibility, right? And so erasure, as you might use it, it might just necessarily mean the figure having a kind of very little physiognomic representation. And so it's not necessarily that the figure is absent, but a sort of almost low resonance.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes I enjoy doing that kind of a lowering of the way the figure is presented so that it sort of unfolds itself at a much slower pace than how general portraiture is sort of done. Mm-hmm. So it in a way, it's almost a kind of slowing down of the image. And so that's why I take that approach sometimes.
Many of your most recent works are portraits of men wearing uniforms. Are these military uniforms? Who are these people generally, and what do they mean to you?
Well, they are military uniforms, but I'm using the sort of the garb in a sort of interesting way, not just as representing militarism, even though that's a part of it, but also the way I use the camouflage. And the camouflage is something I've used in my work for a long, long time. And it's something I've used to, in a way, present a kind of, not erasure, but a kind of hiding.
Conformity.
Yeah, not conformity. That's not the word I'd like to use also, but it's a way of sort of disappearing amidst something very, very visible. But you're seeing it, but you're also not seeing it at the same time.
But why specifically military uniform?
Well,
as opposed to another uniform.
Well, warfare is something that I've also been interested in a long time. I mean, I've done other talks on violence, particularly in Black communities, but more so the issue of conflict, because I don't want people to think that I'm strictly talking about militarism in terms of, American warfare or Middle Eastern warfare and things like that. But the idea of conflict, one person to another person, right? If you read the opening lines of Ralph Ellison's book, The Invisible Man, there's this tension building up as two men approach a single space, and there's this sort of building of conflict. And so that's sort of the social relationship I want to have with the idea of violence.
Mm-hmm.
Not just blood spilling, but the social conflict that comes with that.
And are all of your portraits of men, are they male figure?
Yes.
They're all, is this a purposeful, it must be a purposeful decision. What is the significance of this for you?
Well, it really started when I was a student at the Edna College. At the time I was graduating, there was a huge uproar in the country whereby 7 young men were killed in Britain. If your listeners remember the incident, the Britain 7 it was dubbed. Right? And this was at the time when Inspector Adams, who was a well-known policeman who sort of had some people would say, heavy-handed way of enforcing the law. Right? Now, when these 7 young men were killed, I was still in school at the time. What was happening in Britain was something profoundly different from what was happening in the country at large. So everybody thought that, this was wrongful deaths, it was a sort of heavy-handed thing. But when you actually go into Britain and listen to the people talking, there's a profoundly different response to what you're hearing in the media, in the news, and so on. And so when I realized this discrepancy, I started to look at the way in which we are presenting ideas about people.
And men.
Men specifically,
Mm-hmm.
but let me say black people.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's the media image,
Mm-hmm.
and then there's actually what happens. And oftentimes those two things don't coincide.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So I started working on a painting titled Britain 7 before I actually went into the community. And it's a very important lesson learned, where I'm making a work based on the national response. And then having gone in and spoken to people that know some of these men,
Mm-hmm.
I'm realizing that the painting I'm making is actually opposite to the what was happening in the community. And so I had to almost change the image midway in
Wow.
making that. Change the image midway in making that work. And it was something that I think changed my trajectory, totally in portrait making, but also in art in general, whereby I often think about, well, what's the general consensus and what's the individual relationship?
Mm-hmm. I didn't realize that there was this social engagement, because that is social engagement. I didn't realize that there was that social engagement aspect to your practice, or at least even
Right.
that particular work.
Right. Yeah, it's something that I've looked at as content in and of itself. The
Mm-hmm.
way in which we've figured out how to present a particular Jamaican narrative,
Mm-hmm.
and how that narrative in a way affects the international community and how we're seen. And that's one aspect of ourselves. But also how we actually know things are in the country. That's a different aspect of
Mm-hmm.
ourselves. And so I've always looked at those sort of bifurcated visions of what a singular person is, what a country is, what a region is.
Mm-hmm.
And we're sort of grappling with that right now as we speak.
Mm-hmm. So portraiture is very prevalent now.
Right.
You've always worked in with the figure. Portraiture is very prevalent now, especially black portraiture,
Mm-hmm.
which has taken a very prominent place
Mm-hmm.
Internationally and locally. What do you see as the social resonance of this? And is there personal resonance for you?
Well, socially, I think oftentimes art, like any other, I hate to say it, industry, but sometimes when we think of industries people think strictly monetarily.
Mm-hmm.
But it is an industry, and I'm not thinking about it in that sense. But art as an industry also carry trends
Mm-hmm.
like other industry. And sometimes you find when things start to creep up as a kind of general narrative that carries a certain amount of prevalence, oftentimes it's not just the artists themselves producing this, but sometimes ambitious artists are seeing trends to tap into.
Mm-hmm.
This is how you get a whole range of artists using the same materials, making the same thing. It's sort of trend developing.
Mm-hmm.
Now, for people who are generally interested in portraiture, you can easily get swept up into these general trends that you see happening in contemporary art circles. And so it becomes difficult to differentiate what it is that originally brought you to the subject as opposed to what's the general narrative out there. For me personally, it's a way to not just tap into the self, but as one of my paintings titled Selves Portrait, it's a way to tap into these varying degrees of perception, interpretation, and things like that. So it's a personal way I've gone about portraiture, but also it's a very public display as well, because we're seeing not just me as an artist, but ourselves as Jamaicans, and we're sort of framing our own narrative, and how sometimes that comes up against the international expectations of our narrative.
Mm-hmm. Do Jamaican history, speaking of international versus Jamaica, do Jamaican history and world politics connect in your work?
Yes.
And yeah,
Yes.
how do they
Absolutely.
intersect?
When I was in school at the Edamame College, I studied with David Boxer, who used to run the National Gallery of Jamaica,
And
and
recently passed away.
recently passed away. And he was one of the few people as a Jamaican artist I've ever seen making works about the Vietnam War, or things. There was no subject outside of his scope, and I always thought that was a very interesting thing. And I remember talking to him about it once, and he said one of the big problems that we tend to run up against in the country, in our art community, is that we regionalize our thinking quite often. And in a way, it becomes a kind of insulation, and we disassociate ourselves from global politics. And to see, it's a very interesting position, because it's something that I take personal in a way, that we should have the right to speak on, international politics. Because yes, we've sent Jamaicans to World War II to die,
Mm-hmm.
to defeat the Germans. We've sent Jamaicans to build the Panama Canal. So we've engaged the world at large. So if that is true, and those histories are also true, then the artists also have a full-blooded responsibility to engage in any narrative across the world.
Mm-hmm.
And I speak on that as a Jamaican.
How would you say that your work engages world politics?
Well, for a short while, I've been using the image of the bullfighter as a kind of subject, but in a way, how the history sort of developed, and how it's in many ways relevant to our sort of social relationship. Now, if anybody understands the sport, it's the breaking of animal, right? And there's a sort of very systematic way in which the animal is broken. And if you understand that narrative, and you look at, for instance, colonialism, is a very similar and systematic way in which Black people have been broken throughout the entire Caribbean. It's almost identical in the ways in which they've wounded the animal, in the ways in which we are wounded. It's sort of a similar thing. So I started using the image as a kind of springboard, not to talk about bullfighting at all, really, but to use it as a kind of springboard to talk about some of the social relationships that we have with colonizers from time immemorial, and how we have sometimes, as the bully does, win the battle, right? And so it was sort of a kind of overarching idea for a local principle.
However, in those paintings, the black figure also occupies the space of the matador as well, which is
Yes, and that's an interesting play on the who is the aggressor, right? Oftentimes you'll see in my work a sort of there isn't a clear aggressor in a lot of my works, and I purposely keep it that way to force the viewer to look past the sort of early presentation of the narrative and sort of peel away at just the sharpest response to the image and look more carefully at how the aggressor also sometimes have passionate aspects to themselves, how sometimes the beaten person also has aggressive points to themselves, and so this tug and war between who is a victim, who is not, gets blurred in a lot of those images.
in the journal Caribbean Quarterly, which featured your work. You talk about the inability to see the person before the citizen, the land before the location, the habits before the culture.
Hmm.
Can you expand on this thought?
Yeah, it goes back to what I've been saying about the portraits, the land before the location. Let's take that one. We tend to frame our region as paradise, right? And that's what I mean when we think of the location, when somebody's going on location for a kind of paradise experience. And oftentimes people enter the country, and in a way you're confronted with the land, and those discrepancies again come up on a lot of tourists and so on and so forth. But also for the people who live in the country, we have to deal with those discrepancies ourselves, because we inhabit the land, but we have to also deal with the narrative of this is paradise. So you have a strange misalignment in our social minds, that we are supposed to live in paradise, but somehow we live in something totally different. And the ability to reconcile that has not we've not found a way to do that up until this day. And it goes for the same for the land before the location, the person before the citizen. All along that trajectory, we have a sort of double consciousness, as it were.
Yeah, that's
You
what
know?
I was going to.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So that's
we're
what.
like looking at ourselves from the outside as well as
From
from
the
the
inside.
inside. Um, yeah, there is a recurring allusion to war, violence, or death. You mentioned the word conflict.
Yeah.
But I see war. I see death. I mean the carcass. There are carcasses that are recurring in there. In some of your titles, such as elegy, and in the costume imagery. These are for me all these references to ideas of war, etc.
Right.
How does war and violence factor in your work? You touched on this, so in more detail.
Well, if you look at that particular word, elegy, a lot of the carcasses I paint, they're open, and you can see the tissue, you can see all the internal entrails and so on and so forth. But if you look at the human, quote unquote, human forms to the left and right, they're empty shells. A lot of those things have nothing inside it. And so even the carcass itself is a full-blooded thing that had life, and had a full-bodied experience. But the things to the left and right of it that in a way caused its death are nothing themselves. You know what I mean? And so that again, playing on what's the aggressor, and what should we sympathize with and what we shouldn't sympathize with. And I oftentimes reverse those things.
So there's an immateriality to the aggressor.
Yeah.
And then a very material presence for the what would be the victim in.
Mhm. And that gets even executed in the way the images are produced.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, the painters have a way of treating the material with a certain kind of historical reference and a certain kind of traditional narrative and so on and so forth. I sort of skipped past all of that, and I decided to, how I paint something, quote unquote, full-blooded paint something, next to, printing something, next to using stenciling, next to, so you come across a whole array of application that sort of almost not just juxtaposed next to each other, but almost conflict with each other. So the work is not seamless as you move back and forth through the image. So different things are painted differently, treated differently,
Mm-hmm. In
applied
one
differently in
painting.
one single.
Mm-hmm. I think it's interesting. This is not really a question, more of like a
Yeah.
commentary. In in talking about things like oppression and conflict, I think it's interesting to look at the immateriality of what would be the aggressor or framed as the aggressor in your image, and then the materiality or the full fleshiness of
Mhm.
the victim or the carcass. I think it's interesting when you think of these systemic forms of like
Right.
of ways that we victimize people. Sometimes you're looking and you can't really find the source of these kinds of systemic oppressions. Like sometimes people talk about systemic racism,
Mhm.
um, you know, systemic the systemic ways that post-colonialism is affecting us. Sometimes you're looking and you can't find this immediate source of some of the things that you're going through as
Right.
a body in these spaces, but
But
yet still you're a victim to.
well, one of the problems with that is that uh, sometimes aggression comes in the way of civility, and I talk about it also in the artist statement that there's a certain kind of civility when groups of people are sort of put together, and oftentimes that civility is a way to mask raw brutality, right? So in this looking at where to find the source of your oppression, it's in the legal system, it's in
Mhm.
all this sort of systematic
Veiling.
veiling and sort of civilizing, quote unquote, of any kind of industry or culture or whatever you want. There's this kind of whitewashing, as it were, to in a way confuse and create a kind of mysticism around why people are being oppressed. What? Because nobody's going to come out and simply just oppress people with just pure raw violence. It has to be sort of systematized in a way, especially in post-colonial time.
Yeah, you mentioned that also in Caribbean Quarterly, a subtle sort of violence that presents itself within the norms and forms of
Of
civility.
civility.
Yeah.
Of civility. And this is where you come up on, I mean, a big part of my work also deals with class conflict. What we have in Jamaica, there's a kind of, as I said in the text, a willful sort of invisibility of middle class Jamaicans having no responsibility to the country is a very bizarre kind of oppression, right? So when we talk about violence in Jamaica, when we're talking about unrest, we are talking about a specific demographic. When we're talking about um, the murder rate, be 100% sure we are talking about dead black people, right? It never spills over into any other demographic in Jamaica, and that by itself tells you that the country is not just a violent country. The country is a violent country to black people. The country is a violent country to black people, and so if we are to then say, if we are then to look at the government and say, oh well, we need this to change, we need that to change, we have to also address why is it systemic to black people, and because we have not addressed that, This is why the problem persists.
Formally, and with your materials, you use flat black paint
Hmm.
in your work. You
Right.
mentioned this earlier. Um, how are you using black? Because you get the feeling looking at the painting that is more than just a color, it's a conceit, a conceptual conceit. Is it a formal choice or a conceptual one?
It's both, really, in the sense that, and sometimes when people say both, it's just a easy way to sidestep the question. But it
No, it
actually
makes
is. No,
sense.
I've seen people use it skillfully, but it's actually both. Why is that? It's because of the people I'm influenced by.
Mhm.
Kerry James Marshall is like such an important artist to me. But it's how it's what the color represents also throughout art history. Throughout history, let me not just relegate it to art history, throughout history itself. And it's almost a way to assault, as it were, the history of painting.
Mhm.
I mean, there are many, many essays written by, time memorial artists that forbids the use of black paint
Yes, like you
altogether.
must mix your own black
It's
or a version of black.
So when an artist says, "Really? Okay," and sort of just go all the way in,
So this is black paint
that
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 you did not. This is like straight out of the
straight out
tube.
of the tube
Yeah.
black paint, and so that in a way, there's something almost liberating about that carries a certain kind of energy in and of itself. And that's one of the reasons, just aesthetically, that's one of the reasons I kind of use it as a language, almost to pay homage to people like that, but just to also experience that freeing way that artists have come to just use the color.
You you. I mean, you kind of mentioned this already. You have already said that Kerry James Marshall has been an important influence
Very
for you.
important.
Um, are there any other artists who continue to influence you formally, intellectually?
Yeah, there's a whole range of people like Omari Ra. I have a lot of respect for people like David Box. I have a lot of respect for Box, of course, art historian. Sometimes when you're an art historian, people say, you have certain kinds of aesthetics that, historians have and so on. But no, he's a real deal artist, and I have a lot of respect for him. Um, Milton George
Mhm.
is, a god in Jamaican art. But sometimes when you look at Milton George's work, it's hard to see how I would be influenced by that, because it's like pure, it's sort of, expressionistic in a way. But I'm not just, when I'm influenced by an artist, I'm not just looking at something to use in my work, which is what I find artists often mean when they talk about influence. I'm also looking at the way an artist approach his or her work, the way they go about thinking about a problem. And that you can also learn from, not just the thing on the surface.
Mhm.
I could go through a whole bunch of people, but
Mhm. You have shown extensively in Jamaica and abroad,
mhm.
but you live and work in Kingston or in Jamaica. What has that been like for you? And because most prolific artists, contemporary artists
Mhm.
from Jamaica or the Caribbean, they're operating from the diaspora,
Mhm.
right? You are a prolific artist. You're very active. However, you're based in Jamaica.
Mhm.
What has it been like for you? And how do you think, what do you think has sort of equipped you to navigate those spaces from a practical
Right,
standpoint and also otherwise?
right. When I graduated from the academy, the chairperson at the time, her name was Eileen Guggenheim. She asked me, there's a couple of people are interested, to see my work develop in New York, and the first thing I said to her was, I'm going to go back to my own country, because I think that Jamaica needs, quote unquote, a Phillip Thomas more than New York City does. Uh, Oftentimes you find, and there was a whole generation of Jamaican artists that did this. They go off to other countries, and somehow the work takes on, some sort of roots there, and they never return back to the country. And so that has been something that has been irritating for me for decades. I can't even tell you how long. And I decided that I was not going to be one of those artists. And if it is that, it means then and the fear was for many people, oh, if you strictly stay in Jamaica, you quote unquote get stuck here. That's bullshit, because if we so-called live in an international community, then it's easy. It's even easier to traverse those international spaces. And so, I had no problems coming back to my country and investing in it. Teaching at the Edam and the college. Giving lectures. Just investing in the country, because at the end of the day, and this is something that people have heard me say time and again, it doesn't matter how many museums out there in the world collect your work, or how many galleries show it, or whatever it is not yours. This is yours. And so we must ensure to safeguard it, we must ensure to sustain it, we must ensure to defend it against people that want to ruin it. So those things I take very, very personal, very, very serious.
Mhm.
Uh,
So that leads into the next question that I would like to ask you, which is, what are the differences? Since you're very fluid and mobile between the two spaces, what are the main differences between exhibiting here and exhibiting abroad?
well,
And you've exhibited in New York, LA, and Canada, all
lots of
over, yeah.
Europe shows.
Europe.
I mean, the quickest thing that people often do when they try to compare Jamaica to any other space, art spaces, of course, the resources. Of course, the systems through which things get, done quickly, or whatever the case may be. We must remember that the external, or the so-called first world art communities have been doing this sort of thing with unbelievable amount of resources, for the longest time. I think what the National Gallery has done on string budgets for, I can't even tell you how many decades, has been a fantastic work. I mean, I remember as a student going, and this is as a high school student, going to the Edna Manley, not the Edna Manley College, but also the National Gallery, and looking at the exhibitions that they put up, and knowing that there was, it was almost a magic trick, if you want to say that. There was so little fun, so little resources, so little everything, but just the will of our people to see to it that we can put forth the best show that we can. And that's always been something that's been inspiring to me. So I oftentimes try to refrain from comparing our art community to, what you see in New York and so on and so forth. As for the how you're seen, that's a particularly interesting thing as you go from your own country to another space. And of course, being a Caribbean artist and being a Jamaican, we oftentimes have to come up on somebody who thinks that they know what your culture is about more than you do. And partly we are to blame, because we've been funneling a lot of this bullshit for so long that it tends to come back and become a kind of calcified version of ourselves that we have to confront out there in the world. So those things, I've been able to navigate as best as I could. Let me say it that way.
Yeah. You teach at Edna Manley College, as you've mentioned, and so I would. This is a transferring of knowledge moment. What advice would you give? Do you give your students, and newer artists out there would be tuned in, listening to you right now? What are the biggest pieces of advice that you would give them?
Pay as little attention you can to careerism. Be in love with art first. You know what I mean? I come up on students know that it's difficult to impart certain kinds of information because they don't have just a, and it sounds simple, but the simple foundation of love of the thing, right? You find a lot of people nowadays sort of become knee-jerk, reactionary careerists, and it doesn't mean it won't work, but it's sort of working for the wrong reasons. And so you get these, empty sort of reamed out stylistic kind of thing. But I would advise people to just be in love with what you do, because that's the thing that sort of propels an artist to work, to constantly working, to constantly thinking, to constantly showing. You know what I mean? It always surprises me when artists, an exhibition's coming up and they have to work for it or they have to do this for it. And why don't you have dozens and dozens of works just working on? Because that's what you do as an artist. You sort of, it's a really sad state of affairs that we've become so, for want of a better word, fucking professional. You know what I mean? It's just we've become so mechanized that we get into the hamster wheel of, well, this is what artists do, this is how artists function, this is how, and the work is the last thing on the roster. And you see it in education now all over the place. You see people, learning how to craft their social media pages, and they learn how to craft all this thing.
In
And
education, in art
just
schools.
in raw education, I've seen people with websites and didn't even graduate institute. You know what I mean? Just this weird sort of cart before the horse situation. You know what I mean? So the first thing you need to do is love what you do. And if you just don't have that, you just don't have that. But you
Mhm.
need to be passionate about what you do. And so that's one of the first advice I'd give to people. Secondly, I would say spend time learning about what it is that you love, because having the passion for it is one thing that doesn't necessarily make you into an artist. Having the will to sit yourself down and learn thoroughly and theoretically what it is that you're so passionate about, it turns your passion into tangible outcomes. And that's the thing that, again, added to your passion makes it even more worthwhile.
Anything else?
We could sit here all night. There's a lot of things that we could really talk about and go through, pitfalls. I mean, I was very, very fortunate to have, people like Cecil Cooper and David Boxer and so on, who, even though they were teachers of mine, they sort of gave me real conversations about what it is. They didn't sugarcoat things, and they didn't sort of go around and beat around the bush and keep this sort of I'm an educator, you're a student relationship. It was sort of a camaraderie in a way. It was a very interesting thing for me personally, because it forced me to start to question a lot of things that I wouldn't have questioned just having a good lecturer. To impart art information on people, it's you're not giving them just text work. There are life lessons that artists impart onto other artists, and this is what a lot of people like that were instrumental in, and that's why they were so good at their jobs.
Mhm. Speaking about an ongoing practice, have you done art residencies in the past? And um, would you say that art residencies have factored into your practice or career as an artist? Even though you say you don't think a lot about career, but have you done what? How do you think of residencies? And
Um, personally, I've I've been
and I ask you this because residencies are so popular now.
they've become as a matter of fact, I've started to look into when they sort of took off as a thing.
Yeah.
Sometimes I do quirky, studies to find out, when did this thing sort of take off and what are the ramifications of it and why is it the way it is. Residencies certainly got an uptick as a kind of way to enter the art world. And again, I mean, personally, it's not something that I've seek to do. I was invited to one once, and I've not done anything like that since. But that doesn't mean that if I'm not interested in it, it doesn't mean other people shouldn't be interested in it. If that's the way you want to go, then that's fine. I'm not, saying that oh, you're vulgar careerist. I'm not saying that.
There's also different kinds of
There are
residencies. There's
many,
some that
many
are
different kinds.
so focused on networking, and others that are
See,
really just like you
sitting in a space,
remotely in a space,
thinking about your
yeah.
work, and I'm sure those are fantastic. So if it works for some people, it may not work for others. I'm probably one of those people it doesn't work for.
I take it at first you were not drawn, you didn't
No,
feel the need to do another one after the first one.
No. But I've seen colleagues of mine had gone on residences, and they came back like alive and refreshed, and it works for some people, and I'm totally happy with that. Totally. It's just however you go about your best practice, do that. You don't have to follow any kinds of trends or anything.
So what are you working on now?
I'm working on. I was invited to an exhibition in Miami coming up in December, and I also have a solo coming up in February. So I'm sort of working on those two exhibitions simultaneously. There is also I'm really concentrating on the Rex Nettleford conference coming up in a week or two at the Edna Manley College. I think this is another thing I'm interested in putting more effort into. I don't want to give the impression that I wasn't before, but I think when we again compare our local institutions to our international institutions, when Yale or Harvard or whoever it is that's putting on exhibition faculty shows, there is a certain kind of fervor, and it comes with quote unquote the reputation of the institution and so on. There is no reason we should not have the same fervor for our own things. I find that sometimes as people we tend to fall short when we're on the island, and then we become geniuses outside. It's just bullshit that sometimes irritates me, you know what I mean? So I think it's so those three things I'm sort of looking at some of the directions I've made chosen in my work, and seeing what fits at what place the best way. And so it's a matter of editing, looking at things, creating new things.
Is the faculty exhibition, is it going to be a part of the Rex Nettleford conference?
Yes.
Okay. Do you have information that you want to share about the other exhibitions, or should we share that at a later point?
We can share it at a
later point in time. Sure. Well, thank you, Philip, for being here.
Sure.
And to our audience, thank you for tuning in. Thanks for joining us for this episode of In. You can listen to all the other 24 episodes that we have now on our iTunes podcast or our YouTube channel. Just search NLS Kingston or NLS In, and tune in next time.